our defense of Cuba needs to be front and center. The danger for Cuba now is the capitalist restoration. And so the position for leftists needs to be solidarity with Cuba. We need to force pressure our governments to break that oil energy blockade.
Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. My name is Oden. Right now, the US is strangling Cuba. Since February, President Trump has blocked all oil heading to the island, and he's even threatened countries with tariffs if they try to get around this embargo. The situation in Cuba comes in the context of Trump's attacks on Venezuela, and specifically or especially the takeover of Venezuela's energy sector. Venezuela was Cuba's main oil supplier. The consequences of Trump's actions in recent months have been absolutely devastating. We really cannot overstate the human toll that this embargo is taking. There are rolling blackouts, and basic services, things like sanitation, garbage collection, have ground to a halt in some parts. The embargo is even affecting the ability to harvest or transport agricultural products, produce. It's affecting the water supply, which requires electricity for pumps and things like that. It's having a really catastrophic effect on hospitals, which are having to ration power and even postpone medical procedures. But as listeners of this podcast undoubtedly know, what is happening in Cuba today did not start in February. It's just the latest chapter in over 6 decades of imperialist attacks. The US actually first imposed a trade embargo on Cuba in 1962 in order to punish the Cuban Revolution, which had occurred a couple of years earlier, and stop it from spreading to other Latin American countries, spreading elsewhere in the world. Since then, both Democratic and Republican presidents have maintained the blockade and actually sometimes even tightened it. So Bill Clinton, for example, actually strengthened this embargo back in 1996. Coming back to the present day, Trump has undeniably tightened the screws even more in recent months. Looking a little bit deeper here, it is part of his strategy to reassert US dominance across the Western Hemisphere, tighten the US's imperialist grip on Latin America. It is part of what's been called the Don Roe Doctrine. The broader goal here, though, is clear. In fact, it's been the goal since the start of the embargo back many decades ago. Regime change, paving the way for capitalist restoration, allowing in foreign capital, and rolling back the gains of the 1959 revolution. For the Trump administration, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Cuba's historic legacy of anti-imperialist defiance and socialization of private property must be erased. On this episode, I'm joined by sociology professor Remo Erdosain for a far-reaching conversation about the situation in Cuba. Remo explains the history of the embargo on Cuba, including its origins as a response to the Cuban Revolution and the ensuing expropriation of capital, and he goes into what's behind Trump's recent aggressive moves. Remo also, as someone who has spent some time in Cuba, describes the devastating human toll of the last 6 decades and how profound an attack this has been on the Cuban people. And we also discuss the current situation in the broader context of the so-called progressive governments of Latin America, like Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, Lula in Brazil, leaders who talk big game when it comes to solidarity with Cuba and denouncing these measures, but ultimately haven't challenged the US-imposed strangulation of the island. They haven't, for example, sent any oil to Cuba, which is what the island needs right now. Importantly, Remo explains what it'll take to defend Cuba against these imperialist attacks and fight for the Cuban people. Crucially, we talk about how we do this without supporting the political project of the Diaz-Canel administration, which has in recent years taken a repressive turn and move toward capitalist restoration measures at the expense of the working class. Because some of the measures we talk about that the US government wants and is putting forward, these goals of capitalist restoration that I mentioned earlier, some of these are things that the current regime in Cuba is already taken up. And so we need to be clear that our solidarity is with the Cuban working class. The Cuban working class must directly participate in and lead this fight, must prevent the erosion of the gains of the revolution. The most urgent task, of course, is to break the oil blockade, and a mass movement of students and workers could force the hands of people like Sheinbaum, people like Lula in particular. In the US, we need an anti-imperialist movement that rejects the oil blockade and takes actions like strikes and mobilizations to denounce these attacks on Cuba. Because the struggle of the Cuban people isn't some isolated event. It is the struggle of the global working class, and as we've discussed in recent episodes, like when we discussed the war in Iran, it is deeply connected to Trump's other attacks. I want to quote here actually a recent article on our pages that I'll link to the show notes, which says that Trump's assault on Cuba is part of the same political project as his assault on immigrants, on unions, and the rights of workers here at home. The hand that starves Cuba is the same hand that is sending ICE agents into communities, that attacks our democratic rights, and that concentrates wealth and power in fewer and fewer hands. So, as we always say here, our struggles are connected. An injury to one is an injury to all, and the Cuban people need our solidarity against US imperialism. If you want to support Left Voice, you can do so on our website, leftvoice.org, or you could go to patreon.com/leftvoice. Follow us on social media, where we use the handle left_voice. If you like this podcast, it is super helpful if you write us a little review, share it with your friends and your comrades. Here's my conversation with Remo. Remo, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with a little bit of history, because I think most listeners are aware that this strangulation of Cuba, this embargo, this really aggressive posturing, didn't start with Donald Trump. Cuba has been under various forms of economic blockade for over 6 decades, since around 1960. And this has been obviously continued and on and off, actually kind of strengthened by both Republicans and Democrats. So my first question here is, what is the origin of this blockade against Cuba?
The Cuban Revolution did not start from the beginning as an anti-capitalist revolution, as a socialist revolution. It began as a civil war of national liberation against the oppression of US imperialism, against Fulgencio Batista, who was the dictator backed by the US, imposing and oppressing the Cuban population. So when the revolution wins in January 1959, they come together in a government with Urrutia, which was not an anti-capitalist. He was a bourgeois politician, and Fidel Castro as prime minister. They first implement a set of policies that were very progressive: wage increases, like housing policies, like freezes on utility bills, and so on. What they encountered was a strong opposition from national bourgeoisie and from foreign capital that blocked their program, that did not allow them to reorganize the economy and the society the way they wanted. And so it took a year and a half of trying and facing that opposition until in July of 1960s, when they passed the law, the bill that allows them to expropriate large parts of the economy. And in August is that they expropriate and nationalize first American industries, mostly oil refineries and sugar mills, because among other things, the American oil companies, Standard Oil, Texaco, I think it was, they didn't want to refine Soviet oil. They were actively boycotting the economy. And obviously, the same thing that is happening today, right? The economy, the whole island was drowning, was choked without energy. And so they nationalized it, they expropriated. And the same with the sugar. We need to remember that sugar was the main industry in Cuba at that time. They diversified later on, but it was a monoculture kind of economy. And so they expropriated most of sugar mills that were foreign owned, that were American. Right after that, they nationalized all American banks in the island. It's just a month later or so that they expropriated and nationalized all major firms across the industry. So it's then that the American government was closely looking with reluctance to the new revolutionary government. They didn't want to oppose it outright, but they were very cautious. When they see those expropriation, Eisenhower in 1961, before leaving office, he imposes the first sanctions and the economic blockade against Cuba. A year later, Kennedy, he launched the first attempt at toppling the government, the attack of the Bay of Pigs. But he also tightened up the sanctions even more, the economic blockade. And then, many years later, many decades afterwards, Bill Clinton in 1996 strengthened this blockade even more, and he passed the Helms-Burton Act, which basically banned all American capital from investing in Cuba. So the U.S. embargo has been, supported, upheld by both Republicans and Democrats over history, and it has had a huge toll in the chances of development and life chances of people in the island, and in the way the Cuban experience has developed in history.
Yeah, it's, I think, a little beyond the scope of this particular episode to go into like a ton of depth, I guess, of the Cuban Revolution, but I do still think it's worth pausing to emphasize how big a deal this was. Like, this was the only successful revolution of its kind in Latin America, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a moment where US has spread its tentacles throughout the continent, where United Fruit is extracting all this value from low income countries, from the peasants, and ruling and basically murdering, slaughtering whoever opposes it. It's a pretty murderous regime that comes through the exploitation and extraction of natural resources from all these countries. And the revolution in Cuba does something that sparks a light that is going to ignite a revolutionary movement across the continent. After the Cuban Revolution, we see revolutionary uprisings in all the southern corner, in Argentina, in Chile, in Uruguay, in Bolivia. It's really amazing. And in Central America too, it was a huge example of revolutionary endeavor and a revolutionary project that was successful. Now, there are also limits on how the Cuban regime itself refused to help those other revolutionary projects across Latin America, and in a way embraced the idea or the doctrine of socialism in one country that Stalin had proposed and had given to the Soviet experience, and that was really a key reason why Cuba remained so isolated. I think that we have to look at the Cuban experience in that light.
You mentioned the toll that these past 6 decades have taken on Cuba. What are the concrete harmful consequences of US policy here? What have been the effects of this blockade on the Cuban people? And I'd be super interested also to hear about your personal experiences as someone who has spent some time there.
Yeah, I traveled several times to Cuba. One of my trips, I stayed 4 or 5 months. I did some work in hospitals and some trainings related to healthcare. So I had a chance to look at this experience from inside, and talk to regular people, and not having the official narrative, or on the opposite side, having the anti-Cuban Gusano or American perspective, right? But let me first respond to the question of the toll of the embargo. It's estimated that the embargo has cost the Cuban economy $1.1 trillion over the last 6 decades. That's a huge amount of resources and money that could have been invested into improving the economy, into upgrading the energy sources, the economy, the industry, and so on and so forth. So I don't think we can blame all the ills of the Cuban economy on the embargo, but it's a huge part of it. And so the embargo alone is associated with poor nutrition, with an increased infectious diseases and non-communicable diseases. Nutrition itself is a very important social determinant of health. You don't see it immediately, but down the road, it determines very much your state of health. Despite these limits, Cuba can boast one of the most efficient and best healthcare systems with the health indicators that in many ways compared to the US in some cases are even better than the US, having an economy that's a fraction of what it is. The consequences have been huge on Cuban health and the Cubans' way of living, on the opportunities that people have to have a job, to thrive, but also on the Cuban economy as a whole, because that lack of resources compounds over time and is a force holding the Cuban economy down over the decades.
I think it's a really important point, the way that Cuba has been able to hang on during these decades, the way that it has been able to thrive in certain ways. I mean, to kind of touch on some of the ways that it's portrayed in the media, for instance, Cuba obviously has a like surprisingly strong healthcare system in some ways. Cuban doctors famously go and help in other areas of the world. How have the conquests of the Cuban Revolution led to this situation? Like, are there aspects of the Cuban economy, the structure of the economy, the ways that the Cuban Revolution kind of lives on in the current era that have helped the country to survive all these decades and have certain thriving parts of its society?
Yes, I think it's intimately linked. Some of the most outstanding examples of how different Cuba is from the rest of the world and the accomplishment, like you mentioned, uh, healthcare, but also how high the indicators of the educational Cuban educational system is too. The Cuban people is one of the highest educated, most educated in the world. The reason why Cuba could do that, even being such a poor and isolated economy, is because the Cuban Revolution and basically the expropriation of the means of production, expropriation of all national resources, allowed for an economy that is to a great degree, I don't want to say like fully or democratically decided, but it is to a great degree driven to meet people's needs. In any capitalist country, what drives most important decisions, most key decisions in the economy is the profit motive. So if a certain investment is going to give profits, then a company, a private investor, a private capital holder is going to make that investment. It's going to basically all the major decisions in a capitalist economy are made by private people. What to produce, how much to produce, what to invest on, what kind of new factories. Like we see all these data centers popping up, mushrooming in the US. Who is deciding that? I'm not deciding that. You're not deciding that, right? It's like people with the money to make even more money and to get more rich that are making those decisions. How many people to employ, when to, where to create jobs and for what, and all those decisions. Well, the Cuban economy, the Cubans were able to take profit motives out of the equation and to decide, make those decisions based on needs and based on certain goals. In an ideal society, in a democratically run society, those decisions would be made by bodies of self-organization and decision making and workers' councils and so on. That is not the case in Cuba. Maybe we can talk a bit more about how the Cuban government and how the Cuban Revolution evolved in terms of politics and decision making and democracy. But it's also not driven by the Elon Musks, the Jeff Bezos of the world, who only care about their pockets and their bank accounts and their profits. There is much more of an attempt to meet society's needs. And that's what has allowed to dedicate those few resources, much fewer than here, but dedicate those to improve healthcare system, improve education, and just to give an example of how that plays out in the healthcare sector, the WHO, the World Health Organization, since 1978 has identified the strategy of primary healthcare, which basically means prevention, making them not get sick, and improving lifestyles, nutrition, and so on, instead of investing in curing. So the WHO has identified that strategy in 1978 as the best strategy, the most efficient strategy to keep a population healthy. It's been almost 50 years, and the US has been doing exactly the opposite. You know, Cuba has done what the WHO identified. The reason why they can do that is because getting people healthier doesn't give profits. Profits are in the treatment of disease. Profits are in surgeries and all that. And that's what has been driving the US healthcare, which is the most expensive in the world and has horrible outcomes. The healthcare system here in the US is great at making profits. It's awful at keeping people healthy.
Yeah, I think it's a super important point about the Cuban government, and I want to come back to that a little bit later about, its current response and how it's evolved since the revolution. But I wanted to bring us up kind of to the present day because although, as you emphasized, with, for example, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Bill Clinton, this is in some ways like a conversation that we could have had kind of at any point in the last like few decades, and it's certainly something that socialists have been discussing and criticizing. But the reason we're talking about this now and today in particular is that Trump undeniably has been further strangling Cuba by threatening tariffs, for example, on countries that supply it with oil, and is really, is really strangling the country. Why is Donald Trump doing this? Why is he doing this right now? What is his ultimate goal with these really provocative measures?
The goal of the Trump administration and Marco Rubio, let's remember Marco Rubio is from a Cuban American family, strongly anti communist. The goal is capitalist restoration, is to restore capitalism in the island. The example of Cuba that is a non-market society and that is still surviving and giving all these examples of international solidarity and maintaining people healthier than in the US. Those are examples that cannot be tolerated, especially in a moment like now where people are more and more questioning capitalism and shifting towards embracing socialism as an ideal kind of economic system, whatever that means for anybody, because that means different things for different people. But the younger generations, we know they're way more likely to embrace socialism, and so they need to eliminate that example. They need to crush it. They need to erase it. And so I think that's the main legacy that Cuba still represents, despite changes that have happened since the early years. That's one of the things they want to crush. The other thing is Cuba has always been an example of victorious anti-imperialist struggle, right? The initial goal of the revolution was to liberate Cuba from the tentacles of US imperialism and the exploitation and oppression that US exerted on the island, on the people in the island. So that's also a great example of challenging US imperialism that they want to erase. This happens in a context where the US has shifted their national security strategy towards, what they call the Monroe doctrine, like a play of words between Monroe and Donald Trump, but basically is turning more towards the Western Hemisphere or to the Americas and enforcing a tighter control of Latin American governments, the toppling of of Maduro, the kidnapping and decapitation of the Chavista or Maduro regime was a step that led toward this naturally, because let's remember Venezuela was the main provider of oil to Cuba. And so after taking out Maduro, taking out the Venezuela loyals, starting negotiations with Delcy Rodriguez, which who seems to be very happy to now align with the U.S. government and the reapproachment between the two countries. Well, it's much easier to do a chokehold on Cuba and asphyxiate Cuba, as people are saying, this energy asphyxiation.
Speaking of Venezuela and the importance of other countries in the region providing some support to Cuba, providing oil to Cuba, I want to ask how other governments in the region are reacting to recent events. In particular, how are the so called more progressive governments like President Lula in Brazil, President Scheinbaum in Mexico, how are they reacting to Trump's aggressive moves here?
Well, there's a lot of talk and fiery speeches, but in fact, in effect, they are really collaborating with the US government to choke Cuba. Both Lula and Sheinbaum have interrupted any shipping of oil to the island. This is kind of shows the political bankruptcy of those center left governments in Latin America, what used to be called the pink tide. Lula, in particular, was part of the label pink tide in the early 2000s. Sheinbaum is kind of a part of a new generation of center left governments, but they are both the same. You know, it's a kind of left that I think it's more accurate to call center left, that has a progressive rhetoric and breaks in a way with previous neoliberal governments in the narrative, but at the same time, it reinforces much of the same market driven decisions. The decision to interrupt shipping oil is to maintain good relationships with the US and not face tariffs, not face economic consequences. In the same way, these governments are not seeking to break with capitalism. Whoever thinks that these are truly socialist political projects is tricking themselves, because they are working within a framework where to lift people out of poverty, to create jobs, to improve the indicators of the population in many ways, it is necessary to grow the economy. And to grow the economy, you need investments, right? This is the capitalist framework that they're not breaking with. And so while they might pass progressive policies in, let's say, I don't know, increasing minimum wage or encouraging unionization in some cases, at the same time, they are trying to keep conditions for national and domestic and foreign investments that would attract capital and encourage that investment. And that means keeping labor costs low, maintaining a low level of class struggle, disciplining those examples of workers that dare to take over a factory or that disrupt the economy in a way that's not acceptable, that may threaten investment. So they're, in a way, they're enforcing capitalist discipline that would allow, in their view, to obtain a decent growth and improve slightly the conditions of the population.
Let's talk a little bit about the Cuban government. And my question here is sort of twofold. On the one hand, I want to know and get a sense of how the Cuban government is responding to Trump's moves and to the oil embargo. And secondly, I mean, we did emphasize how the Cuban economy, the remaining gains of the Cuban Revolution, have helped Cuba's resilience. Like you mentioned earlier, how, the lack of a profit motive, for example, has really helped things like healthcare developed and the education sector. But as we've written and as you've written, we don't politically support the program of the Cuban government. Can you talk a little bit about why we don't support the Cuban government in this case? And can you talk a little bit about as you mentioned earlier, how the government has evolved since 1960.
I think, the Cuban government is in a really tight spot. It's hard to say what would realistically get Cuba out of this bind, especially from outside Cuba, because let's be honest, there is no revolutionary movement, anti-regime in Cuba now. If there was that, I would say that's the way to go right now. And that needs to still be our program. But let's first describe a little bit of their response. The Cuban government has given concessions. First, they announced that they were releasing political prisoners. I think yesterday they announced they were releasing more, like 2,000 or so. One of the biggest concessions that they announced on, I think it was March 16th, on national TV, on this TV show called Mesa Redonda, which is the main news discussion TV show that they have. They announced that Cuban Americans were going to be, from now on, able to invest in the island without any cap on the amount invested and without any restrictions on where, how to invest, meaning they could invest in strategic sectors of the economy like energy or like healthcare. They even allow for public private partnerships. In the same interview, in the same breath, the economy minister, who was in the TV show, announced also that they were opening for any investment from the US. Now, we know that the Helms-Burton Act that Bill Clinton in 1996 passed doesn't allow capital from the US to invest in the island. But this was also a sort of a wink to the US government saying, look, we are ready to receive your capital, your investments. It's you need to change this policy so that they can do it. I think it is a concession from the regime, but I think it would be wrong to just interpret this as the Cuban government engaging in a kind of opening that they would have otherwise completely opposed, because they have been actually at the helm of opening the economy. In the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, there was in Cuba what they call the special period. Special period they were preparing for the revolutionary armed forces in Castro prepared the population for, had been a period of war. War, and particularly they hypothesized there would be a war with the US. But this one was a different kind of special period. They called it special period in peaceful times. It was basically an economic disaster, there was no war, but the huge, enormous, and indispensable lifeline that the Soviet Union had been giving Cuba for decades suddenly was no longer there. And so part of the changes that they implemented then to survive was to open the economy to foreign investment, mostly from Canada, from Spain, and a lot of it in tourism. So we've seen how Cuba has become a very appealing touristic attraction, which in the past 5 or 10 years has also declined quite a bit. But around the 2000s and 2010s, a lot of the money that entered the island was through the economy of tourism. Now, these are all changes that the regime itself implemented. And not only that, they implemented many other changes, and especially in the 2010s and early 2020s, land acquisitions, small businesses, encouraging the private economy in many different ways, public-private partnerships. In 2024, there were like 70,000 layoffs from public, obviously, they're all public, or all, the only large employer in Cuba is the state, right? That's still the case. So, and this, when I lived there for a few months, it was very interesting to see how some of these things that we discussed just now about how the economy works when the profit motive is taken out of the equation, how those played out in real life. And I remember talking with an employee at one of the museums, and she told me she worked every other day. And I asked, "Are you paid half of the regular wage?" And she said, "No, no, we're paid the same. We're all paid the same wage, roughly the same wage. And there's a little bit of variation, and it's a really really low wage, but they have other ways to make up for that. Free education, free food, rationing book for food and all that. Housing is free. But that was so interesting to me because when I was there, and I'm talking about 10 or 15 years ago, it was so interesting to see that that was a way to get rid of unemployment. There was no unemployment. Those who had to work every day, they had to work every day. There were places where that was not needed, and they would go to work one day and every other day. So those are some of the gains of the revolution. To some extent, still remain today that the U.S. is trying to take away, and the regime has undermined over time. The rationing book is a great example too. All families, all households have a little book that they go to the dispensary, or it's a sort of a corner store, but only for this. Every month or every week, depending on what they're getting, they would get, I don't know, I think it's one chicken every 2 weeks. They get eggs, they get sugar, they get oil. So that has been severely undercut in the past 10 years. And that's part of bringing back the commodification of daily life. It's basically about that, right? About to what extent life and society is commodified or not, to what extent you need to buy the things to survive, to live every day, and to what extent they are given to you as a right from the government. So this is the arm rest that is taking place in Cuba: commodification versus decommodification, and that's the attempt of the U.S. government with the collaboration, let's say maybe reluctant collaboration of the Cuban regime. This puts leftists maybe in a difficult spot, because what is our attitude toward this, towards such a government, towards this regime, towards this society? There's a huge deal to defend in Cuba. And there's this partial, but it's quite large, decommodification of daily life, free education, free healthcare, rationing books, to some extent, full employment. All those things were possible because of the nationalization of the economy, the expropriation of private owners of resources, of firms, of factories, and so on. So, like, one big part of what we advocate for on the road to socialism is done there, the distribution of resources, right? Now, what the part that's lacking, the part that's missing, and has always been missing in Cuba from the beginning, is the direct democracy, self-organization, some kind of bottom-up democracy, workers' councils that at every level in the economy, from neighborhoods, from factories, from workplaces, schools across the country, make decisions, conscious decisions, about where to put the resources, where to invest, how to work, what to produce. That has not been the case. And there are rosy depictions of that. You can also hear similar accounts of Venezuela, the popular power, popular democracy bodies. That's a myth. That's not real. The Cuban Revolution was led by a revolutionary army, like a party army, that necessarily was top down. You can't run an army not top down, right? That way of achieving power, in a way, determined much of how the economy in the country was run years later after taking power. I think we also need to stay away from visions that it was, from the very beginning until now, a military dictatorship, ruthless. No, yeah, there was political repression. We know you couldn't talk about Trotsky because it was, they embraced the Soviet style anti Trotsky politics and censorship. But, when you compare the record on human rights of Cuba versus any capitalist country, I am 100% sure that Cuba is favorable. And again, I'm not denying that there aren't political prisoners, that there's no repression, there's no censorship. There has been all of that, for sure. After taking power, there were organs, local organs, that were supposed to be, decision-making, popular power, popular democracy organs like the so-called CDRs, Comités de Defensa de la Revolución, which were, neighborhood assemblies that initially they started as neighborhood militias to guard at night, against attacks, which were many from the U.S. I don't know how dozens of invasions and attempts and they were supposed to work as an organ of local self-determination, democratic decision making, taking the input from the grassroots upwards to the higher organs of decision making. The truth, and this is also based on what I've read from different perspectives, but also it's based on my own experience living in Cuba. Those organs are controlled by the party, the Communist Party of Cuba. And those places serve more as a surveillance body of the neighborhood than anything else. Many people have told me their real concerns, their real opinions, they don't voice them in those CDR meetings because they know that the point person of that assembly, the president of the CDR, is an official of the Communist Party. And they play the role of conveying wherever there's dissent to the organs of power. And the result is you're not going to get the job you want. You're not going to get some privileges and small benefits that other people that are loyal to the regime will get. In this regard, there's a long tradition in the Trotskyist left to advocate for a political revolution. Since the gains of the social revolution, the expropriation of the country's resources is already done, but what's lacking is the democratic decision making. So basically, it's a political revolution against the political caste that has grown and has become a top-down leadership by a revolution led by the Cuban working class. Now, this is key because it can't come from outside, especially now in this context. Cuba is under attack by an imperialist power, by the imperial hegemon. So we need to be very careful. Our defense of Cuba needs to be front and center. The danger for Cuba now is the capitalist restoration. And so the position for leftists needs to be solidarity with Cuba. We need to force pressure our governments to break that oil energy blockade. Comrades, leftists in Latin America need to put pressure on the Mexican government to resume the shipping of oil to Cuba. There's a great example in Brazil, for example, the two largest labor unions in the oil sector have issued statements demanding Brazilian government, Lula, to ship oil to Cuba, to save Cuba. I mean, this is just a matter of not even, of course, it's a key question for socialists, right? But we need to think about the immediate impact of this energy asphyxiation. It's trash piling up in all streets. It's lack of food. It's intermittent blackouts that interrupt hospital care, thousands of surgeries that cannot be done because they can't trust the energy grid anymore. All these policies, sanctions, the energy blockade is an act of war, an attack on human rights, and it's directly hurting the population in Cuba. And it's trying to bring about a regime change, but the direct target is the Cuban population. Anyone with any sense of the defense of human rights and solidarity should be advocating for breaking this oil blockade. And that's also the task for us, for leftists in the US, to mobilize, to go on strike, to get our unions to pass resolutions, to get our unions to engage in actions, real actions that have consequences, strikes, mobilizations, roadblocks, whatever it takes, intervening in struggles that are going on, no king's protests. There's a call for May Day. We need to shape the demands, push our unions, our organizations to put the defense of Cuba, to demand oil for Cuba now so that we can really exert an influence, make a dent on this imperialist onslaught on the Cuban population, and it would be a small contribution to help this great example of anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist project alive today.
I think that's a really powerful place to end it. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.